This past weekend, there was a lot of really good volleyball that happened, but one in particular that really stuck out was when number one Texas went up against number 20 Stanford. Texas is, in a way, almost potentially trying to repeat what they did last season by going to the finals. And Stanford right now is currently trying to find their identity. And I think by the end of this video, guys, you're going to discover real quickly that both of these teams are to really be look out for this season, especially Stanford. And when we talk about Stanford, it's going to be very interesting to say the least. The more I keep thinking about it, the more I'm realizing Stanford is going to be a threat this season. And let's get into today's video. I'm going to start off with Texas in this video because Texas did win this match, but I will talk about Stanford later on in this video. Texas won this match in 3 sets. They won it 25-22, 25-16, and 25-23. Some key things to look out for Texas coming into not only this season, but just some things to mention is they're one of the few teams that has their entire starting lineup virtually returning from last season. There's only I think one other team that's that way too, and I can't remember which one it was. But Texas already looks like they're in playoff mode right now just by the fact that these girls understand who their teammates are, how they play, and how they do things. So Texas is pretty much on a mission this year. I mean, last year they did only lose 2 matches last season, and those 2 matches were against Rice and were also against Kentucky in the national championship. So Texas this season is potentially looking to win it all, and they already look like they're in playoff mode right now, which can either be a good or a bad thing depending on how the season goes. Obviously, injuries could play a huge impact if the season progresses, but as of right now, Texas already looks like they could make a push to win it all this season. But there are some things, though, that Texas does need to worry about a little bit. If Texas does play against a team that has a decent enough serving team behind them, Texas can struggle a little bit on passing. It wasn't shown a whole lot against Stanford, but there were moments where Texas did get aced a couple times from Stanford, and they did struggle with being able to pass the ball from Stanford's tough serves. But for the most part, Texas is a pretty sound team when it comes to serve-receive. Like I also mentioned, they're pretty experienced. They can handle pressure really, really well. In fact, at one point, they were down 17-12 in the first set against Stanford, and then they ended up going on a 13-5 run to win the first set 25-22. So Texas can handle pressure situations really, really well, especially when they're going up against a team that has nothing to lose. So pretty impressive from Texas right there. The other thing that's really scary about Texas too, they're a very well-balanced team. Just watching them in general, there was hardly anyone who stuck out to me the most. Like sometimes when you watch some volleyball teams, you're like, oh, this outside hitter is really good, and they stick out, and we know that every time they touch the ball, it's an instant kill. I didn't feel that way with Texas. Every time it just felt like someone else was getting set, the ball could be put down by anyone at any single given night. Texas is a very well-balanced team. There are, though, some issues. For instance, Logan Eagleston, she has to help lighten the load for Skylar Fields. Skylar Fields did have more attempts to get more kills, and I think she had 10 kills in the end, whereas Logan had about 13 on 24 attempts or something like that. But Logan is going to have to help with Skylar being able to help carry the offensive load if that is the case, because I don't think Skylar can take a heavy load all the time, because the more swings it seems like Skylar gets, the more tired she gets. And so Logan has to be able to balance out Skylar in a way. But the other thing too is they do potentially need to set Asia O'Neal a little bit more. Asia O'Neal is the middle blocker for Texas. She is actually the daughter of former NBA star Jermaine O'Neal. And Asia O'Neal, she had a really good match. I don't expect her to always have a good match like this, but she will be a key component for Texas going into this season. For instance, She had 7 kills on 10 attempts for hitting and was hitting about 600%, which is really impressive for a middle blocker. She had 4 service aces in the match with 1 solo block and 2 block assists. O'Neal's going to be a huge factor for Texas. If you need to run middles, O'Neal could be that offensive weapon that Texas is needing to use. And so Texas really needs to figure out how to get her more involved in the offense, because then it can also help lighten the load for, like we were just talking about, Logan and Skylar. The other thing, too, is there's another player that might be a reason why Texas can win it all or not this season. Her name is Melanie Parra. Parra is from, I believe she's from Mexico, if I'm not mistaken, but she's the newcomer on the team this season. And one thing that's great about Parra is that Parra is actually a decent server. She didn't show up on this match against Stanford. She missed a lot of her serves, but when the one time she did make her serve, it was actually a really, really good serve. And so Texas just has a depth that I'm not seeing with other teams right now in the college volleyball world right now. Not only that, but it doesn't matter which libero they put in currently right now, because the liberos that they have are just as deep and they're able to dig the ball just as well. So to me, Texas has this depth. I think they have more depth than Baylor potentially, because all I keep hearing about is how Baylor has this really in-depth team this season, and it's like the deepest squad that Baylor's ever had. I actually think it's Texas right now. So I think a match that we all need to start looking out for is when it's Texas versus Baylor later on this season, because if Baylor keeps saying they have this depth that they keep telling us, but in reality it could be Texas, that could be a potential 5-set thriller, and they play back-to-back nights with each other. So it should be a fun match to watch in general. Last thing that does need to be mentioned for Texas before we get into Stanford is that Texas, I believe, can win it all, but Texas also needs to become more focused as a team. Texas is really good at communicating with each other, and like I mentioned earlier, they can handle pressure situations, but they can't take their opponents lightly. They need to go into every single match this season with an intensity of, we can do this, we're the best team in the nation, no one can stop us, we need to play our game. Because if Texas does that, there's no one going to beat Texas this year, at least right now, because Texas is pretty stacked as a team. Pretty well balanced on offense, really smart plays, in the right spots defensively when digging. So Texas is going to be a really fun team to watch this coming season, because they came to play against Stanford. But Stanford, like I had said, revealed a little bit of weaknesses in Texas's offense and defense, but for the most part, Texas handled business pretty well in general. And with that, let's now talk about Stanford. Stanford is going to be a huge threat this season in one way or another. Okay, it was mentioned at some point during the broadcast that Stanford has, I believe, 2 seniors, 1 or 2 juniors, and the rest are all sophomores and freshmen. Stanford is a very young team, but they're going to grow up really, really fast before our eyes in the volleyball world because of who they're playing. They're playing a lot of ranked teams early on. I expect by the time the Pac-12 actually starts for them that they're going to be a more mature team, and that their errors are going to drop tremendously because they're going to know who they are. Their coach is going to know what to work on. And so Stanford's a real threat this season. Do not underestimate Stanford, okay? Even though there are some things that need to be pointed out that could be worked on, and then there's some other things that show how great of a team they can become. So for instance, like I said, they're a young team, still learning, still growing, but this match against Texas, they had 11 missed serves, and so far on the season, between their first 4 matches of the year, they're averaging about 10.5 missed serves a match, okay? So virtually 11 missed serves a match is what they're doing right now. Stanford needs to drop those numbers. They got to figure out how to make their serving better. I mean, it's great that they're serving tough, and it's always helpful when that happens, but they need to figure out how to keep their serves in, because Texas only had about 8 missed serves, if I'm not mistaken, versus Stanford's 11. And this is the crazy thing about it too. When Stanford was up 17-12 before Texas went on that 13-5 service run. Stanford at that time was hitting .519 as a team, and Texas was only hitting .240, okay? For how young Stanford is, they were hitting .540, okay? Stanford's really good offensively because they're young, but they need to be able to control and dictate the offense and how they want things done. Because at that same point too, with hitting .519, their hitting was keeping them ahead. But up at that point, Stanford and Texas, Stanford had about 5 hitting errors versus Texas's 2. And then Stanford had 4 service errors versus Texas 1. At 17-12 with Stanford hitting at .519 versus Texas's .240. Okay. If Stanford had made less errors, Stanford could have won this. Probably even pushed it to 4 or 5 sets because they had the lead. And this wasn't the only time either. In fact, in the start of the third set, Stanford was leading in kills 28-23. They had way more hitting errors. They had 11 hitting errors versus Texas's 4. Hitting percentages, remember, I had just mentioned that in set 1, they were hitting at .519. Their hitting percentage went from .519 to .270. And then Texas went up to .339. And aces, Stanford, because of how many missed serves they were having, they only had 1 ace versus 7 aces for Texas. And finally, for service errors at the beginning of set 3, Stanford had 8 missed serving errors versus Texas's 5. Stanford is a legit team in the making if they can figure this out, okay? If they don't get it figured out this season, be very, very afraid of Stanford coming into next season. But we have to focus on the here and now. I expect Stanford to compete, okay? Stanford they didn't lose by that much in this first or third set. I mean, they lost 25-22, and they were up at one point 17-12. And when they lost the third set, they were up, I think it was like 23-20 against Texas. They just couldn't close it out at the end. So Stanford is a really good team right now. It's just they're very young and just very inexperienced. But when they start playing teams like Nebraska, Penn State soon, and then when they go into the Pac-12, this is going to be a different Stanford team come playoff time. I do expect Stanford to be in the playoffs at this rate for how young they are. And it's just mind-boggling to think that they're doing this now and they missed an entire year, and this is how they're performing right now. Stanford also needs to be able to get Holly Campbell more involved in the offense, their middle blocker. I mean, she is a former national champ. I don't know why they weren't setting her more. In fact, she never even hit. She had 2 kills the entire match, and I think she had like 7 attempts in total. Whereas Birdie, Baird, and Kip, those 3 girls got into double digits for set attempts during the match. Now, granted, their passing did struggle at times for Stanford, but Campbell needs to be involved more in the offense. I mean, she is one of the few girls from Stanford, probably the only girl left for Stanford that has championship experience under her belt. And they need to get her more involved in the offense. She was good with blocking, luckily, during the match, but she does need to get more involved. The other thing that's crazy, too, about Stanford right now is they're still really good at digging the ball, okay? Even against number 1 Texas, they actually had more digs than Texas. Stanford had about 38 digs versus Texas's 34. Stanford was in the right spot almost every single time when Texas was hitting the ball. And Stanford was just able to dig them because they're good at reading defense, and their blocks are still able to slow down the hits that are coming from Texas. And Texas is the number 1 team in the nation right now. So be on the lookout for Stanford, guys. Stanford, they're not going down without a fight this season. And I expect if these 2 teams were to play again in the playoffs, I expect Stanford to grow a lot, to be a more mature team because of what they're having to go through early on in the season. I expect Texas to be the same team, but I expect potentially the results could be different if these two teams play each other in the future come December, mostly by the fact that Stanford was able to compete, even though they got swept in 3. I think Stanford is a legitimate threat this season, and I think a lot of teams are sleeping on Stanford. Stanford is a true dark horse team in the making. I think even right now in the coaches' polls rankings for this week, I think they got moved up to number 14 after winning against Florida earlier, and then competing with Texas, and then of course other teams dropped from the top who are above them. So I expect Stanford to compete this season. Stanford's on a mission, and don't sleep on them, guys. Just don't, because if you do, we could potentially see a Stanford team pretty much rise from the ashes to potentially win it all, even for how young they are as a team. That's it for today's video, guys. I mean, both of these teams gave us a better understanding of what December could look like. Now, granted, things change as the season progresses and teams get better, but Texas could be making a deep playoff run this year, and Stanford could potentially be upsetting a lot of teams in the making. You can't count Stanford out anymore. I remember in an earlier video I had mentioned I don't think Stanford should be ranked. My view has changed drastically after this match. Stanford, they're going to be ranked all season as long as they can keep competing and not get in their own heads and be able to grow up really, really fast, which they most likely are by the time their preseason is done, or their, I guess not preseason, non-conference league goes. And then when they go into the Pac-12, they're going to be a completely different team come Pac-12 season. So the Pac-12 better look out, because Stanford's coming, and maybe the Pac-12 knows it, but at this time, Stanford's a real threat. And that's a really scary thought to think, especially right now, this early in the season. And of course, Texas is going to be Texas this coming year. So we got to keep an eye on these two teams, guys, because I kind of wish December were here already, just so that we can start seeing how things go. But I don't know at this point. Maybe it's good that we keep watching these matches so we can actually figure out what's going to go on. But with that today, guys, thank you for taking your time to listen to this video. I'm going to ask now that if you enjoyed this content, that you please like and subscribe, as every like and subscription we get can help grow this YouTube channel so that we can keep talking about the game of volleyball. And with that today, guys, thank you for taking your time and have a wonderful day.